Experimentation. Without it, we would not be as advanced as we are as a race of humans. Experimentation is defined as a test, trial, or tentative procedure, an act or operation for the purpose of discovering something unknown. But what happens when those tests, trials, and procedures become a lot more sinister and are taken far too far? Let's take a look at 5 cases of human experimentation in this episode of Twisted World. Quite tame in the comparison to the rest of the entries on this list, but still it is a dark reminder of the lengths people would go to prove a point. The monster study was a stuttering experiment in which a total of 22 children who were orphans in Davenport, Iowa would be put through some very traumatizing tests, to say the least. Conducted by Wendell Johnson of the University of Iowa, Wendell had a hypothesis that telling children that their speech was bad would lead to stuttering. He set out to do this and the results were not good. Along with a grad student, Mary Tudor, under his supervision, Johnson would split the 22 children up into groups and would tell children in one group that their stuttering was awful and that they needed to never speak unless they knew they could form the words correctly. In another group, they would be told that their stuttering was just something that would be outgrown and the speech was getting better and better. 2 other groups of perfectly fluent children were told the same things. The plan was to make one group of children with stutters better and one worse, and the 2 groups with perfect speech either continue on as normal or try to make them develop a stutter. Stutters would become so bad that the children would actually refuse to speak, and it actually left mental scars on the children in the first group as well. So much so that after the 5-month experiment was over, Tudor would return to the orphanage to care for the orphans, telling them that their speech would get better. She even wrote a letter to Johnson dated April 22nd, 1940, saying that as time went on the children would recover, but that they had definitely made an impression on them. The monster study earned its name from Johnson's fellow peers, as they were disgusted by the fact that Johnson would experiment with orphan children's minds just to try and confirm his hypothesis. The children did not go on to become stutterers, but 6 of the children from back then would receive compensation to the tune of $925,000 on August 17, 2007. While they did not develop stutters, the monster study did make the children very self-conscious and reluctant to speak in general, making their time later in life a lot harder than necessary. The bizarre thing about all of this was that Wendell Johnson himself had a stutter and still felt largely no remorse for what he was doing to little children. While this case is terrible to think of, altering a child's mind, many do believe it to have been a necessary evil, as it was the largest collection of scientific information when it came to stuttering and still continues to influence scientific views on stuttering today. While not the most haunting case of human experimentation, one must think that in order to perform something like this, that the desired outcome surely cannot outweigh the after effects, and that a caring individual would never perform tests as cruel as these, especially on such young minds. Devising secret methods of killing people with undetectable poison in a place named The Chamber. No, it's not the plot of a Hollywood espionage movie. This is very real, and it was the work of the Soviet Union. The chamber, or as it's known as in Russia, the camera, had a sole purpose of creating a poison that was to be undetectable before consumption and during an autopsy, meaning that it had to be odourless and tasteless. Obviously though, to achieve this, human experiments would have to have been carried out. The scariest thing about these tests is that they actually worked. A former KGB agent who defected from Russia confessed to 2 assassinations of officials with a vapor gun, a gun full of poison that would kill them within minutes. But as far as the autopsy was concerned, the cause of death would have been a heart attack. These newly created weapons were tested on prisoners from the Soviet Union's gulags. If successful, the weapons would have been tested even more to iron out all of the kinks and make the perfect secret murder weapon. Anyone who survived the poisons that were tested on them would have been immediately shot. Other forms of getting the poisons into the prisoners' systems was by giving them a meal or a drink, and were told that they were having medication with them. Once perfected, the substance known as carbylamine choline chloride, or C2 for short, could have been given to a victim and they would be physically weakened, turned very calm and silent, and then die, all within a 15-minute time span. 2 of Joseph Stalin's highest ranking army officers, Sudoplatov and Eitingen, allowed the camera to use poisons only if they were to be used on human test subjects. It's not truly known to what lengths the experiments went to, but if they did perfect it, you can only imagine the horrors within the walls of the chamber. The camera, also known as Laboratory 1 and soon after that Laboratory 12, would close in 1953, but it's believed that the work started there is still being carried out, with an article in the Wall Street Journal written by a former KGB spy suggested that Viktor Yushchenko, a Ukrainian presidential frontrunner, was almost killed in 2004 by something very similar to those that were created in the camera. We can only hope that this thing isn't around anymore, but considering that Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service actually has a lab in the game of creating biological and toxin weapons for clandestine operation in the West, clandestine operation meaning to go completely unnoticed, you may never know if the next major death in government was a natural cause death or if it was at the hands of a hidden assassin. Think of that the next time you consider who the major powers are currently in this world. Going from being the recipient of the Medal for the Care of the German People and the Black Badge for the Wounded to the Todesengel, or Angel of Death, Joseph Mengele is one of the most single-twisted men in history. In 1943, Joseph Mengele was given the opportunity to work for the concentration camp service, where he would have been able to start genetic research on human subjects. His request to do this was granted, and he was posted to Auschwitz concentration camp. He was not the head of the camp by any means. He was in charge of the Romani family group in the Auschwitz subcamp of Birkenau, but that did not stop him from being an evil individual. Mengele had a sort of obsession with twins, people who had dwarfism, anyone with physical abnormalities, and people with heterochroma iridium, or people with two different eye colours. Twins, who were nearly always children, were examined weekly by either Mengele or one of his assistants who would be prisoners of the camp. Mengele would introduce himself to children as Uncle Mengele, give them sweets and generally be nice to them, but would then begin experimentation on them. He would cut off limbs for no obvious reason, infect them with diseases with the intention of transfusing blood from the healthy twin to the infected twin to see if it would aid in curing them, and he would be so unremorseful that the majority of the twins undergoing these experiments would die, all in the name of the Aryan race. When it came to eye colour, Mengele was said to be so interested in them that he would go about trying to change subjects' eye colours through direct injections of chemicals straight into their eyes while they were awake. People with the rare and, in this case, unfortunate heterochromia iridium would be murdered. Their eyes would be pulled from their skulls and sent to Berlin for study. When it came to those with dwarfism and physical abnormalities, he would give them drugs that were completely unnecessary for them, blast them with high doses of x-rays for no reason, extract healthy teeth, and then once finished with the subjects would throw them into the gas chambers, after which their bones would be sent to Berlin for further study. A witness to one of his experiments, Vera Alexander, told of how he took two Romani twins from their block and returned them a few days later, and the two had had their veins in their arms and backs sewn together in an attempt to create conjoined or Siamese twins. The twins would later die due to gangrene, agonizingly after many days of suffering. After World War II, Mengele would go on to South America, where he would, under his real name, manage to travel to and from Europe. Allied forces even thought it to be pointless to go in search of Mengele, as they thought he was already dead. He was hunted by West Germany and Israel intelligence for the remainder of his life though, and would go on to die of drowning after having a stroke while swimming. It's thought that Mengele continued his research while in South America though, so much so that a Brazilian municipality named Candido Godoy in Rio Grande do Sul, Brazil, near the Argentinian border. This town is famous for its abnormally high twin birth rate. This is centered in a small settlement named Lina São Pedro in Candido Godoy, where many of the population are of German descent. It's not truly known if this man did create a town of twins in Brazil, but if he did, it would prove that the work he was doing in Auschwitz was actually working. Is it more scary that this man was unremorseful and evil, or that those experiments in Auschwitz could have actually led to something bigger? But one thing is for sure, sometimes it's okay to be glad that someone is known to be 100% gone from this world. The Imperial Japanese Army did many inhumane things during World War II, but none of that even comes close to the terror that was Unit 731. There were two biological warfare research centres set up during World War II, Unit 100 and Unit 731, and they were set up even though the Geneva Protocol of 1925 banned chemical and biological warfare. Unit 731 though is the most horrific. Ishishiro, a lieutenant general in the Imperial Army, led a team of 3,000 Japanese researchers in Unit 731. The aim of Unit 731 was to infect actual living humans with diseases such as the plague and anthrax. The infected would then be eviscerated or disemboweled without the use of any anesthesia. This was because, without the pain relief, they would be unable to see how much the diseases infected human organs. Prisoners were also often tied to stakes outside and were used as guinea pigs, or logs as they are being called by the scientists, and biological weapons would be tested on them. These included plague cultures and bombs that had been filled with fleas, which in turn were infected with the plague. Doctors would even force prisoners to perform sex acts on one another, where one person had been infected with syphilis and one had not. A former prison guard was even quoted as saying that infecting prisoners by injection was abandoned in favour of forced sex. Once infected with the disease, they would be vivisected at different stages of infection, and their internal and external organs would be observed as the progression of the disease wore on. Because of these forced sex acts, many children ended up growing up within the confines of Unit 731, something that no child should ever have to be exposed to. Sometimes it wasn't even tests like these which saw the effects of diseases in victims. One experiment saw humans locked inside pressure chambers just to see how long it would take before the human body gave in and the victim's eyes popped out. There was even frostbite testing carried out by psychologist Yoshimura Hisato, a truly evil man, where some unlucky individuals would be left outside during harsh winters with various limbs doused in water. Those limbs would then freeze completely off sometimes, and the scientists would then try to set about in finding ways to treat the frostbite. This was all to help their soldiers in potentially cold climates, yet the prisoners they worked on were never seen as humans at all. Other experiments included looking at the relationship between temperature, burns and survival rate, spinning people to death, injecting them with blood from animals, submitting them to gas chambers, being buried alive, being burned alive, or exposing them to doses of X-rays that were lethal. Just before Japan surrendered in World War II, the site of Unit 731 was completely destroyed and left zero evidence of what had happened behind. Remaining prisoners were shot dead and employees were sworn to secrecy. It's also been thought that mice had been kept in labs and that they were harbingers of the bubonic plague, and they were actually released into the wild and they could have spread the disease. A potential of 30,000 lives could have been lost because of this, but luckily there was no major plague epidemic in 1945 or afterwards. Perhaps in a very scary twist, the post-war American administration granted employees of Unit 731 immunity, meaning that they would not be prosecuted for their heinous crimes. The reason? They wanted details of all of the experiments that had been carried out. Did the Americans want this information so that they couldn't be used elsewhere? Or did they want them for themselves? Either way, some of the most terrifying criminals in history managed to simply walk away free because of this, and the frostbite psychologist Yoshimura Hisato even went on to work in the public and private sectors in key medical posts. Is there really any wonder why this show is called Twisted World? North Korea is a sticking point for the rest of the world. Is the country capable of starting a mass war, or is it simply a load of tripe? Well, if Camp 22 is anything to go by, we'd better damn hope it's the latter. North Korean defectors, including people such as Kwon Hyuk and Ahn Myung-chul, among others, have fled the country of North Korea to seek refuge basically anywhere else, and with them came stories about a place close to the Chinese and Russian borders in the north of North Korea, a place that is known as Hanyang Concentration Camp, aka Camp 22. This concentration camp has something a lot more sinister for its purpose other than just murder. Kwon Hyuk was head of security at Camp 22 in 1993 before becoming an intelligence officer stationed in Beijing, China. It was there that Kwon would be persuaded by South Korean counterparts to defect. He then told of horrors that occurred in Camp 22, which he claims is part of a network of prisons that were modelled after the Soviet Union's Gulag. Kwon said that he once witnessed a family of 4 die in a gas chamber from suffocation gas. The gas chambers were attached to laboratories, and the suffocation gas used was for experimentation. He would then go on to say in an interview some years later that, even though they were dying, I saw the parents trying to save their children by giving them mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. One of the most disturbing things about this though is that when asked how he felt when he saw the children die despite the efforts of their parents, Kwon simply said, "I had no sympathy at all, because I was taught to think that they were all enemies of our country, and that all of our country's problems were their fault, so I felt they deserved to die." Not only were they experimenting with deadly airborne poisons, North Korea indoctrinate people so much that the people carrying out and helping carry out these experiments think they are actually doing something that is good. Another former Camp 22 worker, this time a prison guard named An Myung-chul, said that prisoners were also used to practice on when it came to medical procedures. An said that young doctors who needed to practice surgery would do so on the unlucky folk in Camp 22 and would always do so without using any anesthesia, meaning that every slice of a scalpel was another notch of pain for the prisoners. To make this seem even more scary and to show that North Korea will do a lot more than simply kill a person who questioned the leader of North Korea, a man named Kim Sang-hun, a very prominent human rights activist, managed to snag some paperwork from Camp 22, and what was in the papers was pretty disturbing. These pieces of paperwork were letters of transfer marked as top secret and were from February 2002. Each piece would contain the name of a male prisoner, where he was born and when he was born, and a piece of text that read as, "The above person is transferred from Camp 22 for the purpose of human experimentation with liquid gas for chemical weapons." The fact that North Korea are willing to test weapons of war on their own people really doesn't bode well for the rest of the planet. Camp 22 has since closed, but in a bizarre turn of events, a human rights group has said that up to 22,000 people have simply disappeared. About 8,000 people were reportedly transferred to prison camps around North Korea of an original total of 30,000, which means that 22,000 people are unaccounted for and are believed to have been simply allowed to die of either disease or starvation. Camp 22 was one of Kim Jong-un's most brutal prison camps, and it makes it even more twisted to know that these sorts of horrific human experiments were potentially still happening in 2017 in various other prison camps around North Korea, and there may, or is, nothing that we can really do to stop it. Thank you for watching this episode of Twisted World. If you found this episode interesting or were creeped out in any way, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more content of this nature. Be sure to leave a comment down below as well talking about any of these 5 entries, or if there were any others that deserve to be on this list, because in such a twisted world, there's no doubt that there are definitely more cases like these 5. Thank you all for watching, and remember, the next time that you're in the dark,
the shadows have the best stories.